talking football. We've been talking some football this hour. We will continue the conversation right now with one of my favorite guests. He's the lead analyst at Pro Football Focus. Sam Monson joins us right now. Sam, really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime.
So, first time I've had you on since the NFL schedule came out about 2 weeks ago. What to you were some of the top takeaways from the schedule besides the fact Netflix and Christmas Day is about to be a thing for every football fan this year?
Yeah, and honestly, that's one of the biggest takeaways. Not because Netflix and a Christmas Day game itself is particularly interesting, but because of what it does, I think, to the schedule across the board. And we all sort of tend to lock in on strength of schedule, either, focusing on last year, just the win-loss total, or a bit more sort of sophisticated, the points total or the projected wins, rather, of this year. Like, who are the toughest opponents you're going to be facing? But some of the biggest, I think, competitive edges on the schedule, I think, are all the other stuff that slips through the cracks. It's rest days, it's travel distance, it's all this kind of thing. And those are the kind of things that get messed up by days on Christmas or games on Christmas Day on a Wednesday, meaning you have multiple teams this year that now have to play 3 games in 10 days, which is just a crazy amount of rest for NFL players.
Which team schedules do you think actually set them up for success? Is there maybe a metric or something that you look at over at PFF that actually determines like who got a favorable schedule versus a team that maybe didn't?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different ways of looking at it because of the things we just talked about. But no matter which way you slice it, one of the teams with the most favorable schedule out there is the Atlanta Falcons. And I think we're all focusing on this sort of strange Michael Penix Jr. pick at the top of the draft and almost losing sight of the fact that you add Kirk Cousins to a roster that was already pretty good. It was just really lacking quarterback play. And then you hand that team arguably the easiest schedule in the NFL. The Falcons, I think, are justifiably favorites of that division, and they could make noise in the postseason once they get there.
Sam Monson, co-host of Pro Football Focus's NFL podcast, joining us on the show. He's their lead NFL analyst. So, staying with the schedule talk, Roger Goodell made some comments the other day about the NFL potentially going to an 18-game season. I've always felt like the second they went to 17 games, it felt like eventually we'd get to 18 games. What are your thoughts on the 18-game season and when that actually could happen, if it does happen?
Yeah, it definitely felt like a stepping stone along the way. But I do at least like the way that Roger Goodell talks about it in terms of, giving up preseason games in favor of an 18th regular season game, as opposed to let's just keep stacking games on top of games on top of games and expect the same players to play all of them. We are now at least sort of acknowledging, look, preseason at this point has become almost a waste of everybody's time. Even the teams, the NFL, don't want those games. It's not like certain things where, okay, the fans might not like it or whatever, but the teams really want these things. The teams are basically abandoning preseason. A lot of the teams in the NFL are not putting anybody of consequence out in any of these games, let alone, the last preseason game. So I think you could easily get rid of one of those preseason games, replace it with a regular season game, go to 18-game schedule. That kind of allows them, I think, to introduce a second bye week to potentially give everybody an international game. That's one of those ideas that's being floated as well. Massively expand the international game slate. I think all of these things can coexist in a schedule that makes a bit of sense once you go to 18 games and introduce a second bye week.
I'll tell you what, if they do in fact go to an 18-game season, Sam, and the Super Bowl is the day before President's Day, there are a lot of Americans who don't work that day, and that would be ideal for so many people who are out drinking and eating unhealthy on Super Bowl Sunday.
Yeah, it would now become 100% of Americans that don't work that day.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Sam Monson from Pro Football Focus is with us here. All right, so how about some on-field storylines? So Sean Payton said the other day that the Broncos quarterback competition is truly a real competition between the 3 quarterbacks they have on the roster, including their first-round pick in Bo Nix. Are you buying that, or do you think it's Bo Nix's job to lose?
I think it's probably true. I think it's more true for Denver than it would be for, any other team with a first-round quarterback that talks about that. Number one, Bo Nix was deep into the selection of quarterbacks. It's not like he was the first guy off the board or even the first couple. Denver had to basically take what was available when he showed up. So I think there's a degree to which, they just had to take a shot, and he might not necessarily be a guy that they're absolutely in love with, even though they'll obviously say that publicly and make all the right noises. Number two is Sean Payton, and he's shown that he's willing to go with strange options at quarterback. This is a guy that was convinced he could turn Taysom Hill into a viable NFL quarterback and really took a swing at it and kept going. So Sean Payton deciding that Zach Wilson is actually his pet project, or even Jarrett Stidham, wouldn't be the most surprising thing, I think, in his entire NFL career. So I think it's possible, but I think the way that you described it is probably the most likely scenario, that it's Bo Nix's job to lose, but that doesn't mean something won't happen that will lose him that job or make Peyton go in a different direction, at least for a period of time.
Speaking of rookie quarterbacks, I look at the Chicago Bears, Sam. I love their offseason. I love what they did with their extra first-round pick. That was actually their own first-round pick with the Rome Odunze selection. They traded for Keenan Allen earlier this offseason. They already had a decent offensive line. Am I crazy for thinking that Caleb Williams is in a really, really good spot to have a chance to have a very good rookie season?
No, he's in a fantastic spot. The Bears really went out of their way to sort of not repeat the same mistakes that they made with Justin Fields. And whereas Justin Fields was set up to fail in large degree by the Bears, they've set Caleb Williams up to succeed and to try and make sure that if he fails, it won't be through lack of weapons or through lack of help around him. And because the standard is set so low there in Chicago in terms of just all-time passing records, almost every single passing stat that they have all-time is on the table. Like, Caleb Williams could become their best quarterback as a rookie if he's even halfway as good as people think he is.
We're talking with Sam Monson from Pro Football Focus, all things NFL, as we get closer and closer to mandatory mini camps, and before you know it, training camp will get underway. Aaron Rodgers told our own Adam Shine on this very station on Friday, Sam, that any Jet fan who's questioning Nathaniel Hackett and is concerned about him, he says, hey, if you trust me, you should trust him. I'm a Jet fan, so I want your thoughts on what Rodgers said. Should I trust Aaron Rodgers when it comes to Nathaniel Hackett?
Well, it's an interesting way of phrasing that, because I think Nathaniel Hackett becomes viable as long as he's attached to Aaron Rodgers. And it's because Rodgers is perfectly happy to just overrule him at the line of scrimmage and call whatever it is he wants if he doesn't like the play that's come in. And that'll hide a lot of things. If Nathaniel Hackett is struggling as a play caller or dialing up some plays that just wouldn't work, Rodgers will dump those at the line, and Rodgers knows what he's doing. Obviously, he's been in the NFL. He's been playing at an extremely high level, multiple-time MVP. So if you've got a sort of human spell checker at the line of scrimmage to delete the bad calls that come in, yeah, that'll paper over an awful lot of cracks. So I think that's a good way of putting it from Rodgers, even if that's not exactly what he meant, that as long as Rodgers is there and he likes, the overall body of work of what Hackett brings to the table, Rodgers is the guy that can kind of modify the worst tendencies that Hackett has.
When you look at the Jets, Sam, I said this earlier this hour, it's like, on one hand, I think they have one of the more talented teams, talented rosters in the AFC, certainly in their own division. And then on the other hand, it's still the Jets, so people aren't going to be all in on them until you actually see it. How do you view the Jets, compared to some of the other teams in their own division? Because the off seasons for Miami and Buffalo, they've certainly have lost a lot of key players if you just look at it from a big picture perspective.
Yeah, I think they should be seen as a contender. Last year, we expected them to be real contenders going into the season. I sort of feel the same about them. Obviously, it's not exactly the same team, but generally speaking, they've got as good, if not a better roster in overall. It's sort of maybe a little bit worse in some areas, a little bit better in others. But the bottom line is, you put Rodgers back on that team from last year and let him play the whole season instead of 4 snaps, we know the Jets would be dramatically different. They would immediately be contenders as opposed to a team that was just struggling through the season and trying to stay in the hunt long enough to get Rodgers back in the lineup. So it all comes down to what kind of version of Aaron Rodgers we're going to get at 40 years old coming off an Achilles injury. But if he's anything like the MVP that is still in there in terms of talent and ability and what he can do on the field, the rest of that Jets roster, I think, is more than good enough for them to potentially win that division and be a real Super Bowl contender in the postseason.
Sam Monson, co-host of the Pro Football Focus NFL podcast, with us here, their lead NFL Analyst, as we talk all things NFL here on Memorial Day weekend. It's Mad Dog Sports Radio. Jake Asman with you. How about the Cowboys, Sam? And Dak Prescott said earlier this week that he's not concerned about his contract. He's leaving it up to his agent. Dallas is the only team in their city that hasn't made at least the Final Four in their league in the last calendar year. What have you made of the Cowboys offseason and the expectations for them going into this year?
Well, the expectations obviously always remain the same in Dallas. It's show us you can win those playoff games and actually be real contenders rather than pretenders. And last season, again, they were a really good team, but they only beat up on the bad teams and they struggled against the good teams. This offseason, Jerry Jones started it by saying they were all in. It's difficult to divine that from the moves that they've made. They've lost some key players. They've replaced them with, generally speaking, young players or draft picks, and that might work out, but that's a risky strategy. So it's tough to see that this team is dramatically better than it was a season ago when it wasn't good enough to get over that hump. So, 12 wins has been kind of their baseline the last few years. Maybe they can get to that level again, but they don't look like a team that's obviously going to exceed that.
Sam, final question for me. I saw you did a great job putting together a list of the top wide receivers in the NFL. How difficult was it to break down the top 10, and especially how difficult was it to come up with your final five, your top five of your list?
Yeah, it's tough. I think particularly with wide receiver, because we just sort of call wide receivers and rank them and think that they're all the same, but there's some very radically different players and really different positions within that umbrella. And, these guys are not all playing the same position. Amon-Ra St. Brown is, I think, a phenomenal receiver and, potentially a top five guy, but Amon-Ra St. Brown does not play the same position as, Jamar Chase or some of those other guys. So it's difficult to compare like with like. But I think we're in a great age right now of incredible wide receiver talent in the NFL.
He's Sam Monson, once again, Pro Football Focus's lead NFL analyst, kind enough with his time here on a Sunday. Sam, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks so much for stopping by. I appreciate you.
Thanks. Take it easy.